I'm going to tell you about MP3s, how they work, why they're cool, why they're not cool, and all kinds of things in between. Okay, so when it comes to computers and files and things like that, small is good, right? You want your files to be as small as possible. And so MP3 is what's known as a compression algorithm. It makes chunks of data, it makes files smaller. And so compression is on just about everything you encounter with computers. Your iPods use it, YouTube videos are compressed, internet radio, even Blu-ray, which you might not think. Blu-ray looks and sounds beautiful, but it's compressed. Cell phones are compressed, everything. When it comes to sound, video, audio, even Word documents actually are compressed as part of the file specification just to make them smaller so you can fit more. So again, the smaller you make something, the more somethings you can have. Okay, so let's just sort of start with MP3 and what it actually means. So MP3 stands for MPEG-1 Audio Layer 3. So MPEG is also an acronym, and that stands for Moving Picture Experts Group, which is an international sort of consortium that sets standards for these types of things. So the MPEG-1 standard actually has some video stuff in it too. This is just the audio part of that standard. So MP3 has sort of a very storied history. Starting in 1988, 1989, it was invented in Germany at the Fraunhofer Institute, and then came to the US in the form of a patent 7 years later, in 1996. And so an interesting note about that is that the Fraunhofer Institute has actually made about $100 million off of licensing this technology to various audio playing programs and audio playing devices and things like that. So they made a lot of money off it. But they deserve it, it's pretty cool. So in 1998, the first Windows program that played MP3 files came around, known as Winamp. I'm curious how many people have used Winamp. Okay, wow, that's more than the last talk. Okay, cool. So yeah, it had the advantage of being first. I used it for a long time, and it's still a really cool program. Also in 1998, the first portable MP3 player came around. It had 32 megabytes of memory, which is about 10 songs. Unless you compress more, then maybe it's 15. It was a pretty cool little device, and obviously would be improved upon quite a bit later. And then also in 1998, the Recording Industry Association of America said, wait a second, you can't do that. This is, your people are going to record their own audio off the radio, and no one's ever going to buy another CD. So they sued, like they want to do, and they lost. So there was sort of a moratorium on selling these things, but then once the judge decided that it was okay, they sold 200,000 of them, like right away. So then, in 1999, a program called Napster came along. I'm curious who here has used Napster? Okay. So Napster was a program for trading MP3 files. It was specifically for music, and what you could do is if I had some files, I could make it public what I had, and then someone else could just download them off my computer. So, as you may have predicted, they were sued by the Recording Industry Association of America again, this time under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and they won. So Napster died in 2001. It was quickly replaced by Kazaa and a whole bunch of other things, which were then sued and died, and were quickly replaced by a bunch of other things. It's kind of like, you've seen the scene in Fantasia where he chops up the broomstick and then it makes a bunch of other broomsticks? It's kind of like that. So in 2001, the iPod came along, making this a fashion statement, but also a pretty cool device. The cool thing about the iPod, these had flash memory in it, which at the time was expensive and small. What the iPods is, they took little hard drives, which can store orders of magnitude more stuff on them, in this case music. So iPod was very cool for that. In 2002, the iTunes Music Store came, making it, giving people a legitimate way to download MP3s. They would pay money and get MP3s, and they could listen to them. The thing about that is it came with what's called digital rights management, or DRM, which means you could listen to it on the computer you downloaded on, maybe a couple others, but you couldn't share the stuff. You also couldn't edit anything, you couldn't load it in like an audio editing program or anything like that. So it's kind of annoying. There's all sorts of, fuss about if that's fair or not. And to add to the fuss, well, the fuss from the RIAA anyway, in 2007, Amazon started selling no DRM, DRM-free MP3s on their store. So you can download them, you can do whatever you want with the files. You still, within the law, obviously. Practically, you can do whatever you want. Legally, not so much. But so now getting back to the idea of compression. So now I'm going to talk. The rest of the talk is mostly kind of about the nuts and bolts of how it works, and there will be lots of nice things to listen to too. So there are two compression types. There's lossless and lossy, and you can probably guess what those mean. So with lossless, the original data, the original computer file can be exactly recovered, bit for bit, every 1 and 0 you can get back. With lossy compression, you are actually losing information, and you can never get that information back, but you can approximate the signal. It can be good enough, is the whole name of the game, essentially. So the big example of lossy compression is the MP3. And then you've also got JPEG and a bunch of other stuff. If you've seen all these 3, 4-letter things, you'll know that they are all audio, image, and video compression. So that's where lossy compression really shines, is with things that our brain is going to interpret, that kind of thing. On the lossless end, I'm sure you've seen zip before. Zip is just to make general files smaller. It's quite useful for that. It's a lossless compression. For audio, you have FLAC, and FLAC is a freely available, usable, it's not patented or anything, way of losslessly compressing your audio, so you have a perfect copy stored. So we're going to talk about lossless first, and then we'll get into lossy. So with lossless, you don't throw away any data, you're just smarter about how you store it. And so what it does is it looks for sort of repeated patterns in a file, and then sort of squeezes them that way. I'll show you what I mean. So take the sentence, Jean and Sean weaned themselves of European beans. Does anyone see a way we could make this smaller? So EAN shows up a lot, right? So EAN is 3 characters. But what if we say, well, I'll tell you what, every time you've got EAN, just call it $. Okay? And then what we do is at the beginning of our file, we say, hey, just so you know, if you see a $, that means put EAN. So you do the instruction once, then replace it with something smaller. Our original sentence is perfectly recoverable, but it's smaller. It's 10 characters smaller in this case. So that's sort of an idea of how you can make things smaller without actually losing anything. But it's limited. Once you have found all these patterns and stored them, that's it. That's all you can do. And in fact, if you kept going, your table for replace this with that would actually get bigger than your file eventually, which obviously isn't very useful. So it's great, but it's limited. With lossy compression, you are actually throwing away information. You can never get the stuff back. It's gone. But the question is, does that matter? So it matters a lot in some ways and not a lot in others. You have to choose very, very carefully what information you're actually throwing away. If you do the wrong stuff, it sounds terrible. So a smart way of doing it is a good lossy compression codec. So now I'll show you a bunch of stupid ways to do it. So here we have a nice uncompressed image. It's actually really hard to find perfectly losslessly compressed images. So it is compressed, but you can't see it. So I'm going to call it lossless. And here's an example of a lossless sound. Ooh, baby, here I am, signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours. Okay, so that's Stevie Wonder in a nice lossless way. So the first way you can get rid of information is to just sort of cut it out. So now we have lost a lot of information, but we've made our file smaller, right? This image is much, much smaller than the one we had, but we lost a whole lot, right? If you wanted a picture of a butterfly, you kind of still have that, but you don't have the tree anymore, you don't have the wings, which is the best part, right? You're missing a lot of stuff, a lot of important stuff. And so when you do that, with audio, it correlates to this. So that's not so good, right? So if you wanted to compress Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in this way, you basically get dun dun dun, and that would be all you had of the symphony, right? So that's not so smart. And so another way you can do it is to decrease the resolution. So we had, a couple thousand pixels across for that first image. Now we've got just sort of a few hundred, right? And so we've decreased the resolution of our image. You can do the same thing with audio, and that sounds like this. So it's arguably better than the first thing. At least this time we've got, the whole segment of the song, but you lose all the really nice hi-hats, and you lose his voice essentially, and you've just got sort of the bass and the kick drum. So that's still not so good. Another way you can do it is to use fewer bytes per pixel. So here we've got the same number of pixels, but rather than 3 bytes per pixel, I've got just 1. And so if you do the same thing with audio, if you use less bits for each point in time, it sounds like this. Now we've got all our high frequencies back, but it's still not so good, right? It's really, really messed up. And so then, if you do it a smart way, so here's a smartly compressed image. It looks a lot better than the images we've seen, right? There's still some artifacts. If you look around the antenna, you see there's sort of some weird, like, pixely, blurry stuff going on. You can actually get that same thing with the audio, too. So listen to the hi-hats, and when he makes an S sound in this sample. Ooh, baby, for comparison. So if you're saying that sounded exactly the same, that's okay. You will get there. I've got some training materials for you in the other rooms. But it's pretty good, is the point. You've still got, the best word I've ever come up for is garbled. That's all I can think of. Your high end sort of gets garbled, just as the antennae did with the butterfly. So, lossy compression, you can squeeze as much out of it as you want. What's limited, essentially, is by how much you can take, right? I could compress that audio even more, but eventually I'd just start crying. It sounds so bad, right? So it's the same thing with the image. You can compress it, but it looks worse and worse and worse. So with sound, what you can stand, essentially, is determined by psychoacoustics. I know what you're thinking. That's not a real field. But I say, yes, it is. And what psychoacoustics is, I know many good psychoacousticians, actually. It's the measure of perception. It's the measure of auditory perception. So you're testing different things and quantifying them about the way we hear. And that's all what MP3 is based on. Okay, so we're going to start with the basics of sound production, and we'll get to the ear, and then I'll play some cool stuff for how MP3 works. So the sounds we're hearing tonight, from both the loudspeakers and the headphones, are generated by something like this. And so what you've got is you've got a magnet, and that makes a magnetic field, and you've got a big wound copper wire called a voice coil. And so when you put current through a wire like this, it makes its own magnetic field. And you've played with magnets before. You know that if you have two magnetic fields one way, they'll attract. And if you turn this around, then it gets pushed away, right? So the direction of the magnetic field can make it pull and push. So if I put current through, let's say, down, it will move the speaker this way. And if I put current through the other way, it'll move the speaker this way. And so if I alternate my current, I can move my speaker back and forth. And a vibrating object pushes the air together, and then when the speaker comes back, you get sort of a gap in the air, and it repeats this again and again and again. And you can do that if you move really fast. The compressed spots of the air will be close together. And if you do it much slower, they'll be farther apart, and it'll sound like low notes. When they're really close together, it sounds like high notes.